Hi, Sean.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Hanging in there. How are you doing?
Can't complain. Let me introduce this. I'm Robert Wright, publisher of the Nonzero newsletter. This is the Nonzero podcast. It appears both on YouTube, where you're encouraged to smash the like button, and on any podcast feed available, where you're encouraged to rate and review, especially if you're favorably inclined. And you are Sean Mirski, author of a brand new book. I think this is going to show up the day that this podcast shows up, if it goes according to plan, because it's coming out this Tuesday. Is that right?
That's exactly right.
Big day.
It is. Eight years in the making.
8 years. Well, it shows. It's very well researched, very well written, very thorough. Let me tell people what it is. It's called "We May Dominate the World: Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus." Let me also tell people a little more about you. Are you still a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University?
I am. They keep extending it, so I'm not going to say no.
No, don't. And you previously served in the U.S. Defense Department under both Republican and Democratic administrations. And you, have a master's degree from the University of Chicago in international relations or something? You went to Harvard Law School? Is that all true?
That's correct. That's all true.
So this is a book that, on the one hand, is about kind of a history of relations between the U.S. and Latin America, but it has a lot of relevance to contemporary issues, I would say. And in fact, one dimension of this is kind of built into the impetus of the book, I gather, from reading the acknowledgments. I gather that Jack Goldsmith, who, as it happens, has been on this podcast, is a professor at Harvard Law School, made a suggestion to your, or made an observation or something in your presence that ultimately led to this book. And what was that?
Yeah, so he, in a lot of ways, spurred this. But one of the main things was that he had a colleague at the Pentagon who actually, I think they were corresponding about kind of fun research topics for a paper I was looking at. And one of the topics that was proposed by this Pentagon colleague was the question of, how does China's behavior in the South China Sea today compare with our behavior in the Caribbean a century ago? Mm-hmm. And I didn't end up writing on exactly that topic, but it sort of stuck in my head, and it sort of fed into a broader issue that I'd always been interested about, which is, why is it that rising powers tend to be aggressive and expansionist, meaning they tend to pick fights with other great powers, they tend to bully and otherwise meddle in the affairs of their neighbors, and in general, they tend to make a nuisance of themselves as they try and dominate greater and greater slices of the world. And so Jack's comment about, or passing along this comment from his Pentagon colleague made me kind of stuck in my head, and indirectly led to this book starting a few years later.
Okay. And although you didn't focus on exactly that topic, what you focused on does have relevance to China and its current policies. And what would you say about that before we get into the history part? How comparable would you say their behavior in their region and their motivation for their behavior are to ours with respect to Latin America for much of our history?
So it's a good question. It depends a little bit at what level of abstraction you look at the question, because I think at the highest level, what China is trying to do right now is exactly what we tried and successfully did a century ago, which is essentially to become what political scientists would call a regional hegemon. And just to define terms, regional hegemon is essentially when a great power successfully neutralizes or otherwise eliminates every other great power from its neighborhood, which sounds like not a big deal, but it's actually very, very hard to do. Great powers keep trying to do it and keep failing to do it. And the only great power that's actually ever done it in the modern era is, in fact, the United States. And so today, I think, China's ideal world would be one in which, as far as East Asia goes, it is the only great power. The United States has pulled back from the region, at least militarily, almost entirely, and it really isn't capable of coming back in any serious way. And other kind of great powers or near great powers like Japan, India, and Russia are all sufficiently, I guess, far behind China that there's no real question as to who's kind of militarily dominant. And so I don't think there's any real doubt that that's what China's aspiring to do. And in the same way that, frankly, any great power or any power would aspire to do that if it's possible. It's just that very few powers have that ability. All that said, obviously, China, the modern day is very different from a century ago, and so a lot of things have changed: nuclear weapons, trade, technology, and so the way China's going about it, I think, is at least slightly different, and it's also much earlier in that kind of trajectory than, than certainly where we are now.
Okay. Now, I may have missed something. Did you say that China's goal is to get the U.S. to withdraw militarily from the region, or the U.S. already has?
No, its goal is to accomplish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I should goal in the sense that I think that's what the Chinese would, all things considered, prefer, right? It's not necessarily a sort of like, we'll go to war over it tomorrow. It's not necessarily let's accomplish this in the next week type thing. But their ideal kind of end state is a region in which they're essentially the only great power.
And as far as the reason for wanting your region to be like that, in the book, you depict America's motivation for its many interventions in Latin America. And I think I'm now convinced that there are more of those than the average American is aware of in the history of America. There have been a lot.
Yes.
You depict the motivation as being fundamentally defensive. Would you say the same thing about China?
It's a little hard to say, in the sense that, we don't have access to the Chinese archives. We don't know exactly what discussions are going on kind of internally. I think what we do know is the following: that first, especially since the fall of the Soviet Union in the 1990s and the Gulf War, and in general, much of what was happening in the 1990s, that the higher levels of Chinese policymaking have been extremely concerned about the United States as a threat to essentially their regime. And for obvious reasons, that threat has not ameliorated, in the ensuing decades. If anything, I think it's kind of currently peaking, and I expect that that threat will continue to go sharper and sharper from
the
China's
threat itself, as well as the perception of it.
I would say both. I mean, in the sense that certainly, the discussion inside the United States these days is very, I don't know if anti-China is the right word, but very hawkish on China. And so if you're, a policymaker in Beijing and you're looking at this, I mean, I think the obvious takeaway here is it's not just a perception issue, it's an actual increasingly growing threat. And certainly the United States is acting in ways that, directly harm Chinese interests. And so from the Chinese perspective, I think it's completely natural that you have that sort of defensive inclination, and that you're starting to think more and more and more seriously about how to kind of combat that and compete with the United States. At the same time, one of the points that I make in my book is that while these motivations, these defensive motivations, were, I think, primary in explaining the U.S. behavior, it's obviously not the only factor. In a couple of cases, it wasn't even the main factor, and other, factors and motivations can enter the picture. And so, looking at someone like President Xi, I don't know that we see the same sort of kind of civilizational empire kind of rhetoric that sometimes, President Putin brings out. But certainly you could imagine a world in which there's a sort of ideological bent to sort of some of Xi's foreign policy and some of the actions that China's been taking.
As long as you brought up Russia, how would you compare Russia's kind of policy, behavior, motivation in its region, in particular in places like Ukraine and Georgia, where there have been interventions, with the U.S. Conduct and motivation during the part you cover in your book?
Yeah, so I mean, very similar, in the sense that Russia has not, I think, reacted very well to the expansion of NATO closer and closer to its borders. That's obviously an issue you've been highlighting for a while now. Again, this is one of those things where it's hard to say exactly what's motivating Putin. On the one hand, the NATO enlargement, I think, on its own, is the sort of factor that certainly would be consistent with the kind of behavior we're seeing from Russia, which again is not that different from the way the United States acted a century ago. At the same time, Putin also says a lot of other things that sort of seem consistent with kind of more ideological factors in terms of the way, that he's interested in recreating a greater Russia and all that. The primary difference is, of course, is that the United States was much more successful than Putin has been and currently is. I wrote back in 2014, when he first annexed Crimea, that this was a terrible and horrible strategic mistake for Russia. And I think the ensuing years have kind of borne that out. he's more and more being forced, I think, with his back against the wall in terms of, you know, if anything, you know, NATO's grown stronger. It's coming closer and closer to his borders, and I think a lot of the actions he's taken have frankly encouraged that. And so part of that is just a differential in strength. Russia is simply not the sort of great power that the United States was a century ago. Part of that too is that it's just facing a different set of strategic circumstances, and in particular, a much more determined competitor. The United States, I mean, the thing that the nation has always had going for it ever since 1776 is that it was a single power in an entire hemisphere, and that all of its rivals were across the ocean. And those rivals had a lot of interests in the hemisphere, but none of them were as strong as the interests they had back in Europe. And so most of US history has been taking advantage of sort of internal European conflict and dissension to expand American interests. Russia doesn't have that same luxury in the sense that, number one, all of the other powers in Europe are aligned against it at this point. And two, the United States, although it's simultaneously focused on the competition with China, is also, I think, very interested in Russia, and is certainly able to be more focused on that competition than its rivals were a century ago.
So you think it was a tactical, if not strategic, blunder to seize Crimea. In terms of the motivation, it seems like the threat Russia perceived was at least as direct as most of the threats America is reacting to in your book, in the sense that you've got a neighbor right on its border, and it has a very important naval base in the neighbor. It's technically a long-term lease, but is a legacy of the Soviet Union. And there is what looks like, from its point of view, a coup, or in any event, it's a revolution, a deposing of a president who was kind of friendly. And there's, in some sense at least, U.S. support for what just happened. And the U.S. has professed the intention to have that neighbor part of NATO and so on. I mean, that's like, compared to most of the things the U.S. has been reacting to by intervening in Latin America, that's a much more direct threat, right?
Oh yeah, I mean, certainly, I think from Russia's perspective, that's probably the right way to think about it. I mean, Americans obviously see it a little bit differently because
I've noticed that. I've noticed that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and, you know, part of it is, I think, for most Americans, you know, the idea of NATO enlargement, it seems sort of, I don't want to say innocent, but it doesn't seem, or at least it hasn't seemed targeted at Russia until very recently. But, you know, part of what makes international politics difficult is that, one, it's very difficult to communicate intentions in a sort of deliberate way. And number two, those intentions can just change over time. And so, you know, from Russia's perspective, maybe NATO expanding in, you know, the 2000s and early 2010s was not aimed at Russia, but Russia doesn't have any way of guaranteeing that once NATO's up at Russia's border, someone doesn't change their mind and suddenly NATO's turned into an anti-Russia alliance again. And so from Russia's perspective, I think it's understandable why they're concerned that, you know, countries like Georgia and Ukraine would be potentially offered NATO admission.
Right. And that leads to one kind of abstract question before we get into the history. You know, you said it had no way of being assured that NATO wouldn't ultimately be a threat, whatever the motivation behind expansion. And this is a common thing. I mean, there's a term that doesn't appear in your book, I think, which is security dilemma. I'm sure you're familiar with it. You studied under Mearsheimer at Chicago, and that refers to the fact that, you know, one nation, it will read something that another nation does as either offensive in intent or potentially offensive, and will react to it in a way that it sees as defensive. But then the other country will see it as either offensive in intent, misreading it, or see it, the motivation, accurately, but also see that potentially this new thing, this new military base somewhere, could be put to offensive use. And so they react, and you get a spiral. And you know, they're a very related thing is just kind of what I would call hypersensitive threat perception, or certainly, you know, a pretty acute, let's say, threat perception that's very common on the part of all nations. And these things can lead to what, to get back to Mearsheimer, a phrase you do mention in the book is the tragedy of great power politics, an allusion to one of his books. And I guess my question is, you you seem, I want to ask you, do you feel you're defending America's history of intervention in Latin America? You're certainly sympathetic to the motivations of the people doing, your understanding of why they did what they did. And you're, you're not really up for a lot of second guessing of them, I would say. But correct me if I get any of this wrong, then the take home question is going to be, if somebody doesn't quit acting like this, the world is going to blow up, right? I mean, you know?
Yeah, well, so let me take those questions, I think,
Okay.
in the order they were given. I definitely would not characterize this book as a defense of American imperialism or interventionism or anything like that. I think the book itself is, I don't think takes a particularly controversial stance on any of the actual things that we did. And it also doesn't really dispute the effects that those things had on the people that were affected by them, right? And so instead, I think the place where the book perhaps departs from the conventional wisdom a little bit is the motivations for what actions were taken. I think it's worth drawing a line under the fact that regardless of whether we are acting for defensive motivations or out of corporate greed or a spirit of imperialism or white man's burden or whatever, didn't really change, how it felt from the perspective of whichever country was getting invaded and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't see the book as a defense in that respect. I also, I guess I would quibble a little bit with the word sympathetic. I do think that it's important to understand the motivations of American policymakers and to understand why they were acting the way they were acting. Because I think it's easy to caricature sort of unpleasant moments in our history by sort of ascribing it to kind of like a cartoonishly evil sort of sense of why people acted. And I can understand the reasons why that's done, but I think it ends up actually making it more likely that the situations repeat in the future, because you end up in a situation where you sort of assume, well, United Fruit or the banana companies were running American foreign policy, and we don't have banana companies anymore, so we don't really have to worry about that. And I think that sort of misunderstands the lessons of history, which, doesn't repeat literally, but oftentimes rhymes, as the saying goes. And so from my perspective, I think the goal of the book was to give sort of an honest take of why Americans were acting the way they were acting. Not necessarily in a way of sort of forgiving what they did, because I don't really think the motivations necessarily enter into that calculus. I frankly don't really take a normative position on that. It's just a purely kind of explanatory question. And I suppose the final thing that's worth saying on that is that in the book, I was, I think, careful, or at least I tried to be very careful, not to necessarily take what Americans policymakers were saying at face value, in the sense that, like, oftentimes they made speeches and they said things, and frankly, oftentimes those speeches said things that were much more benign than I think what was going on behind the scenes. And so it was not unusual for American policymakers to be making speeches about how, well, we're going to go into these countries and we're going to make them better because we care about our neighbors and things like that. And frankly, I just don't think that was a significant motivator. I think that was one of the kind of like post-interventionist kind of rationales. Instead, I think the book sort of tries to emphasize what these policymakers were saying behind closed doors, in private letters to their, families, and to, in their diaries and things like that. And the message that you see there is consistent with the fact that these policymakers were largely acting based on sort of security-based rationales, and not either for ideological reasons or for kind of economic reasons, which tend to be the sort of prevailing conventional wisdoms. So anyway, long explanation there. To your question about blowing up the world, yeah, I mean, so as you
are
mentioned,
against that. Are you going to take a normative position there? You're against that?
I am against blowing up the world as an inhabitant of the world, though I have a vested interest, so I don't know if I can be trusted to give an objective answer.
Not for altruistic reasons, but you are against blowing up the world. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, look, you mentioned that I quote at the end of the book or allude to the title of Professor Mearsheimer's work, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. One of the sort of unhappy lessons of the tragedy of great power politics is that there's no solution, right? I mean, you have these, for a variety of reasons, you have these certain dynamics, these structural constraints in international relations that lead to invoke the name of this podcast,
Mm.
suboptimal sort of outcomes that aren't positive sum, that aren't even zero sum. They tend to be, unfortunately, negative sum. And so I do think that there's, obviously room for cooperation. And there are ways, as the Cold War itself showed, of avoiding, nuclear apocalypse. Um, but to answer the abstract question with a bit of an abstract answer, I think it's challenging to avoid sort of the spirals and dynamics and structural constraints that tend to lead to the sort of sustained competition. But I do think there are better and worse ways of handling it, and sort of being cognizant of what's really motivating international politics, I think tends to be the most effective way to make sure that the worst outcomes are avoided.
Okay. So, with all that as prelude, let's launch into the history. Uh, I guess one transition would be to say that the U.S. kind of had the luxury of operating in an environment where the spiral that we just described, the kind of positive feedback cycle that can get you a negative outcome, was unlikely to lead to anything catastrophic because we were so much bigger than any other neighbor. So anyway, it starts with the Monroe Doctrine before the Civil War. The actual interventions don't get started much until after the Civil War. Um,
With the,
well,
I guess, the Mexican American War is a fairly big
that's
exception to
yeah,
that
yeah,
rule,
that's
but
not nothing.
yeah.
So why don't you tell us why we started intervening in engineering, and maybe you can start with that as an example. There are different kinds of interventions, but why don't we start with that, and what was the logic?
Sure. So the basic argument I make in the book is that the United States faced what I think could fairly be called a structural sort of problem when three conditions arose. And in the book, I call this the problem of order. Basically, the United States was concerned whenever there was an area of strategic importance, which, for purposes of this book, is essentially the Caribbean and Central America, and to a lesser extent, the rest of the hemisphere. Uh, and that area of strategic importance was under foreign threat in the sense that the United States perceived that one of its great power rivals, usually in Europe, although Japan pops up in the example of Hawaii, when one of its great power rivals was interested in expanding in that strategically important area. And finally, the strategically important area was itself very unstable, politically, it's, civil war and revolution. Economically, it's racking up massive debt. In general, what in today's terms we'd call failing or failed states. And I think when you have those three conditions operating together, an area that's strategically important, under foreign threat, and vulnerable, that creates a problem from the United States' perspective. The basic problem is that you have a power vacuum in this area, and that you have someone else who wants to fill it. And so, what the United States, I think, was trying to do during the period that I look at in the book is, as much as possible, prevent European expansion by sort of resolving these power vacuums. And the United States tries to sort of stabilize and strengthen the weak states around its borders. At first, it tries to do this indirectly through trade and diplomacy and sort of these indirect measures. But first, this doesn't really get the results that the United States needs, particularly on the kind of timescale it needs. And second, from the
How
United
does it?
States,
How do you mean that? How does it fail to do that? The
well, in the sense that, the United States, for instance, lowers tariff barriers, right, and kind of signs these like reciprocity treaties with some of its neighbors. And the goal is that if we have more trade, these nations will be more prosperous. And if they're more prosperous, they'll be more peaceful. And if they're more peaceful, they'll be more prosperous. And you'll get this sort of mutually reinforcing cycle that leads to relatively stable political institutions and less opportunity for European expansion.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't turn out that way. I mean, in the sense that, number one, signing a reciprocity treaty with a nation, in 1890 doesn't mean its problems are going to be fixed by 1891. And as it turns out, in quite a few cases, these reciprocity treaties, just by virtue of the United States' sort of economic size, lead to sort of economic dependence on a scale that actually ends up breeding more problems than it fixes. And so Cuba and Hawaii are kind of the archetypical examples of that problem.
Okay. So,
And oh,
well, yeah, go ahead.
no,
I,
please.
I actually, well, let me interject one more question that's about the past but relevant to uh, the current moment. Um, I, I hadn't realized that we had a tendency in the 19th century, if I read you correctly, to characterize part of the threat we faced from Europe as ideological in the sense that they were monarchists, right? Like today, we are framing our foreign policy apparently largely as a global war between democracy and autocracy, for better or worse. By the way, the answer is worse, but that's the way we're framing it. I was surprised by the parallel, but that's kind of built in from the beginning. It sounds like
it is, although it kind of fluctuates, I think, in how important it is. Certainly, when the United States is, for instance, declaring the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 and things like that, distinction between monarchy and democracy is really at its height. And I think rightly so. I mean, I think the European monarchies at that point were legitimately concerned by the ideological threat that was posed by the United States. And that's true certainly all the way through the Civil War. France, during the U.S. Civil War, invades and occupies all of Mexico and installs a Habsburg prince on the throne of Montezuma. And essentially, the explicit reason to do this is to basically start making the hemisphere safe for monarchy. Emperor Napoleon III basically has this idea that once Mexico is remonarchized, he's going to just start moving south through the rest of the hemisphere and turning all these Latin American republics back into monarchies. And so there is very much that sort of ideological conflict at that point. I do think it ameliorates a little bit in the coming decades. You see flavors of it in the sense that obviously in World War I, there's a lot of sort of rhetoric about Prussian autocracy, and certainly, of course, the phrase "to make the world safe for democracy" comes from Woodrow Wilson at that time. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't. I would say that it's not the ideological factors end up, I think, receding a little bit around the turn of the century. It's less that and more kind of just pure security kind of interests.
So in that case, so France has this kind of Habsburg proxy. I mean, for reason I don't know enough about history to understand why he wasn't just a French guy, but he apparently wasn't, right? And then we, in that case, we basically support a revolution to get rid of him, right?
Yeah, I mean, so the then president of Mexico, Benito Juarez, was essentially already, fighting a civil war against Emperor Maximilian, the Habsburg prince. We end up mostly just providing his forces with support and sort of launching, I don't want to say launching a proxy war, but it ends up being a proxy war. But that was very much a conflict that we didn't necessarily instigate so much as helped Juarez finish.
Okay. And then why don't you maybe list several kinds of interventions, several interventions that represent different kinds of interventions say in between the Civil War and you go all the way up to World War I if you want, if it'll help.
Yeah. Well, and so it starts out, I think, up until like 1898, the Spanish-American War, there's not that much. There are certainly a few, but there's not as much in terms of direct sort of, the United States is not as interested in sort of meddling around with the internal sovereignty of other nations. The one exception is annexation, which always ends up being sort of the last resort for the United States in response to a security threat. And so I have a chapter in the book about Hawaii where, for a variety of reasons, we were very concerned about Hawaii getting annexed by Japan. And in response, essentially, we end up annexing Hawaii ourselves. But starting in the Spanish-American War, what ends up happening is we're left with, we're occupying Cuba at the end of the war. And on the one hand, we promised to give Cuba its independence at the start of the war. On the other hand, we're very worried that if we just give Cuba its independence, that it's going to get snapped up by another great power like Germany. Basically on the theory that Cuba is unlikely to stay stable for long. It's going to descend into civil war. And once that happens, Germany is just going to come in and to scoop up the pieces. And so what we end up doing is forcing Cuba to install the Platt Amendment, which is, among other things, has this provision that gives the United States the right to intervene in Cuban affairs if things get bad enough, essentially.
That was nice of them, I thought, to let us just send troops whenever we want.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because one of the debates among historians is what was the kind of original intention of the Platt Amendment. And I think, my view is that if you look at the author of it, the primary author of it, Secretary of State or Secretary of War Elihu Root, I think he genuinely thought it would be a last resort, and he also genuinely thought it would never be used. Because part of the thought was, well, if we tell the Cubans that we're going to intervene in their politics if they ever have a civil war, the Cubans don't want us in their politics, and so they'll never have a
Mm.
civil war. And it's this sort of what ends up being incredibly naive thinking that ends up leading the U.S. to take a greater and greater role in the region. But that at least was the initial thinking. Um, but that's sort of like and that is not a minor imposition on Cuban sovereignty, but that ends up being sort of the lighter edge of interventions. As the kind of 1900s and the 1910s go on, the interventions start to become much more hard hitting. And so in 1905, one other example of an intervention is something called customs receiverships. So the United States will come in and basically administer the custom houses of our neighbors, which is a little bit like the Chinese coming in to administer the IRS. And the reason that analogy works is because at the time, Latin American states essentially drew all of their revenues from taxing trade through the custom houses. And so if you controlled the custom houses, you controlled all internal revenue for the state of the Dominican Republic or Haiti or wherever. And so the US starts coming in and essentially taking over these custom houses. And initially it's like consensual might not be completely the right word, but at least it's at the invitation of the Dominican government. Over time, this becomes much less consensual and we start taking over more custom houses. At first, we're just administering them. We're giving revenue to the central governments. Over time, we end up starting to use that financial leash to do other things. And so if we don't like the government or we don't like what the government's doing, we won't hand over the revenue and we start starving it of revenue. We end up, obviously, regime change. First time the United States ever openly overthrows another government is in 1909 with Nicaragua. This starts to become a bit of a pattern over the next decade. And so we'll send gunships and basically force presidents and dictators off out of their presidential chairs. And finally, this all just culminates in occupations, including, I think, the occupation of Haiti, which lasts for almost 2 decades, from 1915 to, I believe, 1934. And so that ends up being sort of the spectrum of U.S. intervention during this time. And it comes in a lot of flavors, but I think one of the points that I make in the book is that these sort of early intervention lights end up sort of leading to the heavier interventions, in part because they don't actually fix the problem that the United States is trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. The on the controlling the customs, what is the customs house is the term, or
customs receiverships? Yeah, with the custom houses. Yep.
So yeah, I mean, we use that as a means of control. We also fear that European powers will use it as a means of control, right? And
yes,
and it's interesting the extent to which both the perception of threat we have and the perception of threat that leads, well, whether you want to call it threat perception, but the motivation that leads some European powers to want to exert control over here is about financial matters and fear that the other one will control the commerce, right? I mean, this was an actual European fear, was that the U.S. Government was going to basically control imports and exports for the whole hemisphere. And I guess one question is, I mean, how big a part of the motivations, especially on the U.S. side, but on both sides, were these kind of sheerly economic things? And did the nature of international economics subsequently change so that kind of eventually ceased to be much of a factor per se, or what?
Yes, so that's actually a great question. One point to make at the start is Europeans were, as you mentioned, the concern among American policymakers was that European nations would essentially come in and control these custom houses if the United States did not. And the reason why was because Europe basically was owed a lot of money by these countries. But the thing that statement kind of obscures a little bit is that the money that was owed was not really so much debt on contracts, although that was part of it. It was more that under the international law of the time, and to a lesser extent today, if you're a European country and one of your citizens gets injured in a civil war, or his property gets stolen, you as the European state can essentially champion their claims against the government in question. And as I mentioned, a lot of these countries are incredibly politically unstable. We're talking, a new president every year, sometimes multiple times a year. And so in the context of all these civil wars and revolutions, these European states do kind of rack up enormous claims dealing that stem from the kind of mistreatment of their citizens and property. And I think that ends up being actually much more important for European powers than the sort of, oh, my bankers went in, they signed a contract, and now, the government's trying to kind of welch on that. It's just, that does play into it to some extent, but it ends up being, I think, a sort of secondary factor. And so you're right. So the American policymakers were a little bit worried that essentially to kind of make these countries behave better, that the European nations would sort of come in and start taking over the custom houses. The nice thing is that the situation has improved in that respect in the intervening century in two ways. One, there's been an important development in international law, in part, I think originally sort of proposed by Latin American states themselves for sort of obvious reasons, but eventually championed by the United States to essentially make it unlawful for powers to intervene on behalf of, for instance, like contract debts and things like that. And then kind of beyond that initial development, there's been obviously just more of a norm that you don't get to use military force against another nation just because you might have, economic claims against them. So that's been a huge kind of development, and one that the United States, I think, was very, very in favor of because it sort of eliminated part of the risk that the United States saw. The other aspect of this, though, that I think has been helpful is that the sort of system of international arbitration, particularly investor state arbitration that's been set up in especially, the last half century or so, has kind of ameliorated the concerns that a lot of these powers in general have about not getting fair treatment. Because it turns out that the record of essentially suing a state because they expropriated your property or whatever, most of these claimants actually win and end up collecting on kind of whatever money they're owed. And so because there's now a mechanism that doesn't involve using force, and that mechanism works reasonably well, I think it's actually kind of ameliorated some of the pressures you saw the U.S. responding to.
Yeah, it would be nice to ameliorate all the pressures that lead to
Yes.
to war and intervention, forceful intervention. And there were attempts. I mean, like who's it, James Blaine, the Secretary of State, who wants to set up a system. This is in the late 19th century, where the way you're going to maintain order in Latin America is, a lot of international commerce, reciprocal trade relations, and the U.S. is going to facilitate arbitration of disputes. So it's kind of like a hemispheric court or something is the idea. And, I would say broadly speaking, this is the direction in which you'd like to see the world evolve, right? You just have ways of solving disputes. But these things seem never to work out well enough to prevent another round of intervention, right?
Yeah, and this actually, so Blaine definitely sort of pioneers this approach, although he's not that successful at implementing it. But Elihu Root, who I mentioned earlier, is the author of the Platt Amendment. By the time he ends up being Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of State for essentially the second half of the Roosevelt administration, and he ends up winning, I think, a Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts in favor of international arbitration. And one of his big developments is he sets up this Central American Court of Justice, this court that is meant to arbitrate all the disputes among the 5 Central American nations who are always at each other's throats, always invading each other and sort of causing problems. And he sees this explicitly as a way of fixing some of the disorder and kind of the power vacuums that he's afraid are going to lead to European expansion. The court, though, ends up being a bit of a failure. Part of that, I think, is that subsequent administrations just don't take it seriously, and Woodrow Wilson eventually just ends up killing it because it gives a ruling on an issue that he doesn't like, and so he essentially kind of chucks it out the window.
Wait, which president was that? I missed it. That was
Woodrow Wilson. I didn't get as much into this in the book for a variety of reasons, but the Central American Court essentially concludes that that Wilson's attempt to corner the market on trans-Isthmian canals by taking canal rights to Nicaragua is a violation of the rights of its neighbors, and the United States doesn't like that, and so it essentially pulls the plug on the court. And so part of it is that these efforts, I think, don't really get the kind of the care and energy that they deserve. It's sort of an interesting, counterfactual to wonder what would have happened if you'd had subsequent administrations who had been as committed to them as Root would have been. On the other hand, though, there is the kind of underlying factor here that, a lot of these nations, it's not clear how seriously they take these institutions. And to large part, it does sort of seem like they're complying to the extent that they think that the US is going to be waving, the big stick right behind the court. And if they don't comply, they're going to get, intervened. And so, it's a little hard to do the counterfactual. But the US, in some sense, does take this approach and then scale it up into kind of a global scale at the end of World War II. So it's definitely kind of been a long thread.
And I gather that even the failed attempt after World War I with the League of Nations was to some extent inspired by what's called Pan-Americanism, this idea of having kind of a lawful order within the hemisphere, right? I mean, some of the same people were involved.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and this is one of the things that I just found fascinating in this book, because so much of the way we think about history is Eurocentric or Eurasian centric, I guess would be a better way of putting it, in the sense that post World War II, start of the Cold War, for a variety of reasons, American security interests have been really bound up with whatever happens in Eurasia. And so I think we have a tendency to go back and look at the rest of our history as a nation through those lenses. Well, what was happening in Europe? What were we thinking about, in Europe and things like that? But the point that I think the book one of the themes of the book is that there is this sort of understanding among American policymakers that what happens in Latin America is really what matters most. And so a large part of the kind of efforts that we, pioneer at the global level, like the League of Nations or the United Nations or the IMF, the World Bank, all of these have roots in Latin America. And of course, that makes sense. That's the region where we've been most involved. That's the region where, it's not always fair to describe our attitude towards Europe as isolationist, but at least there's an argument there. When it comes to the Western Hemisphere, there's just no argument. We've always been super involved. And so much of, I think, American foreign policy in, the kind of post-World War II era and post even World War I era really did grow out of what we were doing in our region beforehand, both good and bad, I should say.
So did you at any point add up all the interventions, all the kind of, I don't know what the term would be, extra legal intervention or in some sense, kind of dubious interventions? How many roughly in let's say, I don't know, between the enunciation of the Monroe Doctrine, even though there wasn't much enforcement of it for the first couple of decades, say through World War I?
It's tricky to give an exact number, partially because it's a question of defining terms. So one of the kind of prevailing practices of the time was that if there's like a civil war happening in a country, you can land your forces to protect your citizens, but they essentially just, stay around whatever part of the city your citizens are in and don't really intervene in the rest of the conflict. If you include stuff like that as qualifying as a use of force or, use or threat of force, I don't know what the exact number is, but it's going to be something. I don't know if it's triple digits, but it's going to be approaching triple digits.
Wow.
I can say from 1898 to 1918, we were using force against one of our neighbors an average of almost twice a year. And again, some of those are relatively more minor uses of force to the extent that's a way that you can describe this. Others, it's occupation of entire nations. And so it really sort of spans the spectrum and depends on what you kind of define as an extra legal intervention. And of course, there's also oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there's also the difficulty of what counts as extra legal. So, under the Platt Amendment, we had the right to intervene in Cuba as a legal matter. I mean, one thing that Root was very, very concerned about as one of the best lawyers of his generation was having a legal basis for doing everything the United States did. That was actually in large part why the Platt Amendment was framed the way it was. And the Platt Amendment itself, I think it's fair to count it as a intervention in the sense that the U.S. told the Cubans, look, you can either let us continue occupying you or even annex you, or you can gain your freedom with these conditions. And the Cubans chose the latter. Not exactly a fair choice from the Cuban perspective, but.
And we got a pretty sweet deal with the Panama Canal Treaty too, I would say, or whatever it's called. Now, is it the case, as I understand it, that, okay, so we signed that treaty, but then the person who signed it on the other side wasn't even an actual Panamanian? Is that right? Yeah. Well, he was this like French entrepreneur or something who could make money if we signed it. So, okay, you signed it.
The Panama Canal story is just one of the, just stranger than fiction, I think, through and through. There was this gentleman by the name of, oh my gosh, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name.
Imagine a French person. We'll just have them
Philippe,
imagine a French person. He
yeah,
was
well,
French, right?
yeah, he's
It's a two, isn't it a hyphenated name or something? Or,
it is. It's Philippe Buenavarilla, I think. Oh God, I can't believe I'm forgetting this. Hold on, let me look this up.
I'll
This
look it up. You can go ahead and answer.
no. This is I am so embarrassed because I cannot tell you how much time I've
Looking
spent
it
with
up won't
these.
help with the embarrassment. It's now a matter of record that you couldn't remember it.
I know. I'm on record. Yeah, Buenavarilla. I was right. Philippe
Okay.
Buenavarilla. So he's this Frenchman who's involved in. So the French tried to build the Panama Canal decades before the United States did. They fail. It goes bankrupt. Buenavarilla is this Frenchman who is involved in the effort, and he's primarily an engineer. But for a variety of reasons, he becomes dedicated to having this canal finished under any means, kind of any way possible. And he concludes that the only way to do that is to have the United States build the canal. The problem is that Colombia essentially doesn't like the terms that its representative and the United States representative negotiated for the canal. And so Colombia rejects
and Panama is
at,
I don't know if you said this and I missed it, but Panama is at that, what we call Panama was part of Colombia at that point.
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that. So Panama is still part of Colombia at this point. And Colombia rejects the treaty, and Roosevelt is furious. Americans in general are annoyed. And Buenaventura basically decides that the only way to get the Americans to build the canal is for Panama to declare its independence and then to sign a canal treaty with the Americans. And the Panamanians are essentially on board with this because from their perspective, having a canal through their state is going to be a massive economic boon. It's going to make their state kind of important for a variety of reasons. And so, skipping some of the sordid details, the Panamanians do eventually launch this revolution. Buenaventura is heavily involved. He finances a large part of it. It's always hard to know how seriously to take him because his book is one of the most, his autobiography is just one of the most puffed up pieces of sort of self-aggrandizement you can imagine, but it actually, as far as historians can tell, is mostly accurate. But Panamanians declare independence, and the United States essentially sends 8 warships down to prevent the Colombians from retaking the province. And so the United States helps Panama declare independence. At this point, however, the U.S. basically turns to the Panamanians and says, okay, let's negotiate this treaty. And Buenaventura, in exchange for his help, made the Panamanian secessionists promise to make him their first representative of the Panamanian state in Washington. And they know that this is a bad idea. So they immediately send some actual Panamanians up to Washington to do the actual negotiations. But Buenaventura doesn't really care very much about Panama, does not really care at all about Panama getting a good deal in this treaty or anything like that. And so he immediately turns around to Secretary of State John Hay and says, listen, I'll sign on whatever terms you want. The stronger you can make them for the United States, the better, because we have to get this through the U.S. Senate. And Panama is not in a position to object because the only reason it's independent is because the U.S. warships are off its coast. And so Buenaventura and Hay signed this treaty that is just enormously favorable to the United States. When it goes before Congress, one of its opponents basically says, I've never seen a treaty that is this favorable to the United States. The U.S. Senate passes it, and by the time the Panamanians arrive, it's just too late. It's already been signed.
Not by them,
it's not a.
Right? Was it ultimately ratified in in what you would imagine would be a binding manner by some true representative of Panama?
Yeah, so the treaty was signed by Buenaventura, and he had the legal authority to sign.
He did.
The Panamanians gave it to him,
okay.
And then it ends up being sent down to Panama, where it is in fact ratified by the new regime.
Okay.
Again, not exactly a fair ratification process in the sense that it's not clear what other options they had. The treaty is at the time, I think, greeted with some degree of enthusiasm by Panamanians, although I think it's in part because they don't really understand what it sort of means long term for their nation.
Mm-hmm. So Hawaii is another interesting case. That was just flat out taking it. We want it, we're taking it. We just annexed it. The fear, as you said, was that Japan would annex it. And I think you said that although Americans disagreed, in Congress, disagreed over whether annexation was necessary, none of them doubted that Japan's annexing it would be a grave threat. That was pretty much a matter of consensus. And you might start by reminding us when this was and provide any details, but I'm wondering what your take is on how sure it was that for Japan to annex, it would have been a great threat. Hawaii's pretty far away. So if you could elaborate on what exactly we feared and maybe start by filling in some of the details on, when and so on.
Sure. So Hawaii's a really interesting case, I think, because in a lot of ways it's a sort of slow motion, or not even slow motion, but it's sort of a delayed version of what happened with the Western Hemisphere as a whole when the Spanish conquistadors first came, right? And so part of the thing that they brought with them was germs and disease, and it ends up wiping out a huge proportion of the native inhabitants in a way that historians to this day still sort of debate exactly how that all happened. But you end up seeing something similar with Hawaii, where Europe doesn't discover in quotation marks Hawaii until relatively late into the 18th century, right? And so up until that point, the islands basically been not exposed to European diseases and germs and all that. And then it gets hit extraordinarily hard by this wave of disease starting in the late 18th century. And so what ends up happening is that the Hawaiian population dwindles dramatically. Again, historians are kind of all over the map on the exact numbers, but you're talking easily 80, 90% of the kind of original inhabitants are wiped out by the time you're getting to, let's call it, the mid 19th century. This creates all sorts of problems. But from the US perspective, one of the things that really aggravates it is that Hawaii starts importing Japanese laborers at a very high rate to sort of man the sugarcane fields, in part because there's just not enough native Hawaiians to do the job anymore. And the other portion of the background that I think is necessary is that in 1893, there's a coup in Hawaii where essentially the white residents of essentially Honolulu launch a coup against the then native Hawaiian monarchy, overthrow her, and establish this republic. And from 1893 to 1898, there's this sort of awkward tension in American foreign policy where on the one hand, Americans feel, at least the Democrats, have this sort of sense of, well, we definitely were involved in this coup. We should not in any way annex Hawaii. Republicans, I think, are more in favor of it, but it's this sort of partisan debate about what to do with Hawaii. By 1897, though, there's, for a variety of reasons, the Japanese population on the island has become extremely, extremely large, and the Japanese nation itself is starting to demand voting rights for their laborers on the islands. And Americans, as well as the kind of reigning white Hawaiian Republic, are really concerned that this is going to essentially lead to Japanese domination of the island. And I think the numbers are fairly convincing that was at least not a minor threat. And Japan was acting in a very aggressive way. And so what ends up happening is that the United States, basically to preempt what it sees as a fairly imminent threat of Japanese intervention, signs an annexation treaty to annex the islands itself. Now, you asked, why do we care whether Hawaii is Japanese or not? Mm-hmm. So I think there's a couple of reasons, but one of the big ones is that it's hard to overstate the strategic importance of Hawaii, particularly at the age that it was annexed, which is an age of steamship and coal and all that. And so if you look at where Hawaii is on the map, it's about 2,000 some miles from San Francisco, but it's also about 2,000 miles from anywhere else. It is an extraordinarily unique area of the world in the sense that almost no other part of the world has so few, is both, an ocean itself and has so few actual islands there, which means that in an era where you have steamships and the steamships require coal and coal requires coaling stations to pick up, and you have only limited distances you can travel before you have to go to a coal station, Hawaii ends up being essentially the only gas station in the middle of the entire Pacific Ocean. And so if you have an enemy, for instance, enemy nation like Japan that controls Hawaii, then they can attack the east or west coast of the United States with essentially no problem, using Hawaii as sort of a base. If, on the other hand, the United States controls Hawaii, then there's really no way for the Japanese to attack the west coast in this era, because they simply wouldn't have the coal to make it there. And so for naval strategists at the time, Hawaii is sort of seen as this way of defending the West Coast and basically making it invulnerable to enemy attack.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we haven't talked about the Spanish-American War. Partly, I just figured that's relatively well known. But one thing I wanted to say is I do think you say that it's actually one of the few cases where there was kind of something like a public clamoring for American action. Am I right? I mean, by and large, these things were decided by politicians, by elites. They weren't responding to popular pressure, except maybe in the case of the Spanish-American War.
Yeah, and I think in the Spanish-American War, I mean, the elites were for the most part on board as well. President McKinley was really the one, along with a few of his sort of more business-oriented colleagues, who was, I think, more opposed to the war. But that's right. I mean, the kind of conventional account of the Spanish-American War that you sometimes hear in, like U.S. history classes is that it was, the Jingo Press, the Yellow Press, and all that is vastly overstated. I think historians at this point have sort of, for the most part, rejected that. But it's true that there was, I think, as far as we can tell, there was no polling at the time or anything like that. It is true that there was concern, or that there was a kind of broader desire on behalf of Americans to get involved, in part because it was just such a massive humanitarian disaster. Again, the numbers, are sort
you
of
mean
debatable.
the main or
Oh, sorry.
Before
The actual so the Spanish-American War, we intervened in a conflict that had already been going on for 3 years. So the Cubans had declared independence in 1895, and the Spanish had been basically trying to suppress them for 3 years. And it was an incredibly bloody war. The Spanish used concentration camps to try and clear out the kind of Cuban insurgency. They did not do a very good job at kind of making sure that concentration camps were well provisioned, and so starvation was really rampant. Again, the numbers vary, but you can, some of the figures that at least policymakers were receiving were that something like 1/3 or 1/4 of Cubans had died as a result of this conflict. I mean, just really, really atrocious humanitarian catastrophe right at our borders. And so for most Americans, that was sort of the context in which it seemed necessary to do something. And I think that something ended up becoming a military intervention after the USS Maine famously exploded in Havana Harbor.
And when you say the media's role is now discounted by a lot of historians, you mean the media didn't actually actively fan the flames, or just that it did, but that wasn't really necessary? You didn't need that much grassroots clamoring for elites to decide to do this?
More the latter, but it's more that the role of the Yellow Press itself is sort of overstated.
Mhm.
The Yellow Press was actively making up stories and sort of sensationalizing the conflict, and each headline was more, kind of panicky than the last. But at the same time, there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that the Yellow Press was really kind of read by large portions of the nation, and that those portions of the nation were particularly invested in going to conflict. It's more honestly when sort of more sober-minded leaders and newspapers started taking up the call that I think you really started to see this sort of nationwide momentum.
Okay. So listen, we've been doing this about an hour, and a thing we commonly do here is do the regular public podcast for an hour, and then do what is called in the industry some bonus content, move into overtime. You've been kind enough to say you'll stick with us for that. And the way you get access to that content is you become a paid subscriber to the Nonzero newsletter. You can Google Nonzero and Substack, or you can just consult the show notes in your podcast app, where there's a link to a place where you can become a Nonzero member, and then you have access to various kinds of things. There's the Friday Parrot Room. There's a couple of times a month we have something called Earthling Unplugged, and then a lot of of these overtime sessions that are attached to the regular podcast. So I thank everybody who's listening at all at this point, certainly including those who aren't going to be with us for overtime. But I encourage everyone to be with us. Before we go, is there anything you want to say, to anybody who is going to check out at this point? Aside from buy your book, they should buy your book. But I think it would be better if I said that. It's called "We May Dominate the World: Ambition, Anxiety, and the Rise of the American Colossus." Really is very well written, thorough book, clear in analysis. But what else would you like to say?
I think that's about it. I think the book's for, in some ways it's a book that's set in the Western Hemisphere, but in a lot of ways it's more a book about the U.S. relationship with Europe, and more broadly, sort of great power competition and how great powers and rising powers tend to act on the international scene. And
Yeah.
so, if you're interested in that, if you're interested in spheres of influence, if you're interested in China's rise today, I think it's worth a read.
And not
Hopefully,
just China's rise. I mean, I'll read one quote before we go into overtime. It says, this is from the book, says, making matters worse was the fact that just as the United States was rising to power, the region was slipping into new bouts of chaos and instability. The timing was no coincidence, as the United States ended up massively destabilizing the region in its clumsy attempts to stabilize it. The result was a self-reinforcing loop. Disorder caused interventions, and interventions caused disorder that sucked the United States deeper and deeper into the region's affairs. Some might say that reminds them of the Middle East over the past quarter century, but far be it from me to note such parallels. Anyway, we're gonna well, maybe we'll start by discussing that when we get into overtime. So thanks everybody who's listened this far.